We once prayed here, sang our sacred songs, shoulder to the wheel we pushed along. A wind of doctrine blew my faith cold, broke our hearts, our assembly of old. Brethren, I'm here, I have not strayed. It's not our love that I gave away. Broken brethren, can't we partake just for now, as our hearts break? Communion that once was ours, set aside these pews just for an hour. The Zion we lost wasn't beyond the grave. Broken brethren, it's love that saves. Brothers, we see your tears. Sisters, we see your pain. You don't grieve alone, faith fades, we remain. We shunned each other, let our steeple fall, but we were brothers. Oh, don't you recall? We exchanged our oaths and vows, traded prophets and plates for now. River with our gods to save our souls. Love is written on hearts, not gold. Broken brethren, can't we partake just for now, as our hearts break? Communion that once was ours, set aside these pews just for an hour. Our lost Zion wasn't beyond the grave. Broken brethren, it's love that Brethren, I'm here, I have not strayed. It's not our love that I gave away. Our lost Zion wasn't beyond the grave. Broken brethren, it's love that saves.
Ladies and gentlemen, building a little common ground just to get started with my former brethren and sisters of the Latter-day Saints, because we're going to need some goodwill here, because I'm going to dive into all the reasons why Joseph Smith, well, not all the reasons, not nearly all the reasons, why Joseph Smith is not the creature that Mormons today lionize him to be, and how I think that that's a problem. Before we get too far, I just want to say, we are the Church of Korihor, and nobody is guilty of any crimes that they haven't been convicted of. Well, at least they aren't convicted of any crimes that they aren't convicted of. I want to tell you a little something about me. I'm an atheist. I am an ex-Mormon. And I believe in the Book of Mormon. Whoa, 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 whoa. Don't clip that. Jacob Hansen, talking to you. Word Radio, talking to you. Don't clip that just like that. A little bit. I agree with a little bit of the Book of Mormon. I think a little bit of the Book of Mormon is true, even though I happen to think that the whole work in and of itself is fraudulent. Now, I want to give you an example. I'm going to give a few visual examples here in a moment, but for now, I just want to read to you a little bit from the Book of Mormon. Don't panic, don't panic. We'll get back to the good stuff. This is from Mosiah 29, 33 through 36. And many more things did King Mosiah write unto them, unfolding unto them all the trials and troubles of a righteous king, yea, all the travails of soul for their people, and also all the murmurings of the people to their king. And he explained it all unto them. And he told them that these things ought not to be, but that the burden should come upon all the people, that every man might bear his part. And he also unfolded unto them all the disadvantages they labored under by having an unrighteous king to rule over them. Yea, all his iniquities and abominations, all the wars and contentions and bloodshed, and the stealing and the plundering and the committing of whoredoms, and all manner of iniquities which cannot be enumerated, telling them that these things ought not to be, that they were expressly repugnant to the commandments of God. Now, these ideas seem to me to be common sense, by which I mean the pamphlet Common Sense by Thomas Paine, which was extremely popular during Joseph Smith's day. In fact, you remember, if you know uh, American Revolution history, you know that George Washington would have Common Sense by Thomas Paine read to the troops to lift their morale and to give them a why we fight boost, which America still continues to do today, by the way. Now, of course, the enthusiasm that Americans had for Thomas Paine waned by the year 1805 when the third installment of another series of pamphlets by Thomas Paine came out called The Age of Reason, which today has been canonized as scripture by one godless organization. Us, the Church of Korihor. That's us. And it's particularly good. So good, in fact, that apparently at one point, Joseph Smith's father, also Joseph Smith, when his family discovered that he was considering converting to Methodism, somebody will call me out on this and say I got that one wrong. I don't claim to be a historian, but I read history. When they found out that Joseph Smith Sr. might convert, I believe it was his father or his uncle brought him, I think his father brought him a copy of The Age of Reason. And it is believed, it has been contended for some time, that that is the real origin story of Joseph Smith, that he either read or heard or listened to or was influenced by Thomas Paine's The Age of Reason. And in contrast to The Age of Reason, and maybe utilizing some of Common Sense and other materials like The Late War or View of the Hebrews, if you're a Mormon or have ever been Mormon, you know the accusations that he used these as sources for the Book of Mormon. Which does make sense in some regard, but however Joseph Smith plagiarized and or composed the Book of Mormon, he did appear to me to be mainly responsible for the content of the Book of Mormon. He didn't translate it from gold plates. I'm fairly convinced of that. I'm happy to have somebody show me how they can prove otherwise. But that doesn't mean that everything that Joseph Smith said or everything that he put into the Book of Mormon is wrong. If I look through these teachings of the righteous King Mosiah, that he says of an unrighteous king, yea, all his iniquities and abominations, and all the wars, and contentions, and bloodshed, and stealing, and the plundering, and the committing of whoredoms, and all manner of iniquities which cannot be enumerated, telling them that these things ought not to be. It's hard to argue that that's not wisdom. It's wisdom, whoever said it, right? They said that when the Italians were asked why they supported Mussolini, that they answered, well, he kept the trains running on time. That's a misattribution. Nobody really knows that anybody ever actually said that, but that's hardly the point. The point here is, if those people had said he kept the trains running on time, it might have been important for them to acknowledge or to know, and if they didn't know, to be curious why they didn't know, that some of those trains were pulling boxcars full of Jews. To know your history incomplete, to know the good with the bad, and to understand the humanity of the people who went on before you is important, especially if you're going to deconstruct. Just like deconstructing Americanism or patriotism, deconstructing Mormonism is a process of forgiveness. Now, that's probably not something you're going to hear from somebody else, but I'm a bit of a spiritual atheist preacher. I won't do a whole lot of that tonight. We're going to get to some of the good stuff here. I want to show you some documents here, but I wanted to make that clear off the top. This is what we're getting at. When I say I'm defending the Mormons, I'm defending Joseph Smith against the Mormons. This is what I mean. When you lionize Joseph Smith, bless you, or, yeah, atheist equivalent of bless you. When you deconstruct Joseph Smith, just as anything else, you're engaged in a process of forgiveness. And being someone who has deconstructed Mormonism and supported many of my fellow ex-Mos in deconstructing Mormonism, I can tell you that the process of forgiving the story of Joseph Smith is a long, grueling process, usually involving forgiving the brethren. There's always this question that you'll hear ex-Mos say, do you think the brethren know? How much do you think the brethren know? That's like the main thing that you'll see in like Facebook groups of Mormons who leave the church. Or if you sit down and they say, do you think that the brethren know? Because all of our lives as Mormons, we developed this close, intimate relationship and trust with the leaders of the church that they would not lie to us, that they would not ever, of all things, they would be transparent with us, because all of our lives we were told, if you look into sources other than church produced and church approved sources for learning about Joseph Smith, they will say again and again, and they did it, I'm sure, this last year on conference. I don't know, I didn't watch. But up until recently, they've been doing it every conference. They'd say things like, to go to Joseph Smith's critics for a story of Joseph Smith is like trying to learn the gospel of Jesus from Judas Iscariot, with no sense of irony for the fact that there is a gospel according to Judas Iscariot. So, I mean, again, these are the weird things that we start to deal with. You start to have to forgive the church, you have to forgive the brethren, and over time, you have to forgive ultimately yourself that you believed it, because it's embarrassing. It's oftentimes it's insulting. And particularly, especially those of us who once were missionaries, we wind up asking ourselves, did we really put our family name to selling this doctrine and the teachings of this man? And the process of forgiving ourselves and forgiving God for these things is a process usually often of accepting that there probably is no God. Or if there is a God, he certainly isn't the God we were sold when we were Mormons. Why would God lie to us this way? And I put to you that this is a good and productive route, but I don't preach atheism purely. I preach critical thinking. Let's think critically about Joseph Smith. And this is what I want my friends, the former fellows of mine with whom we shared once communion, the Latter-day Saints. Saints, let Joseph be Joseph. Not for ex-Mormon's sake, purely, but for your own. Because if you cannot accept that this lionized version of Joseph Smith that you have been sold is not true, when you start to deconstruct so that you can work towards forgiveness, maybe of Joseph Smith, though that's not required, maybe of the church, though again, that's not required, or of the brethren, at least your forgiveness of yourself and that you believed this. I often say there are 4 stages of getting honest about your religion. Stage 1, they say, everybody tells lies about my religion. Stage 2, you say, okay, my religion has problems, but you just don't understand nuance. Stage 3, they say, okay, my religion has significant problems, but hey, I'm the one who's bringing up the curve. Stage 4, I can't believe I ever believed this shit to begin with. And just want to just say, it's a little hard language there. I'm going to try to stop with the swearing. Welcome, saints, those of you who find your way in here. I want to tell you a few things, okay? And I just want you to be open-minded in my pleading with you. You would do better to be honest about Joseph Smith on some of these key points with yourself and with other people. Did I say? I might have said lying. Diana. So I'm not going to be closely watching the comments. So you guys have at it. Have a good time. And if we get dissenters and detractors in here, give them help. All right, just kidding. I mean, be nice. I don't care. Do what you want. All right, let me show you a couple things here because I think this is a pretty interesting thing. First of all, there's this claim that gets made by Latter-day Saints that Joseph Smith was not a racist because he was an abolitionist. Now, the claim that Joseph Smith was not a racist because his presidential platform ended slavery, I want to speak on. And General Smith's views, as a matter of fact, let me share it with you. Get rid of our opening hymn here. Hope you guys liked our opening hymn. That was when you go to look for it on our website, you will find it under the name Broken Brethren. Let's see here. Share screen. Boom, boom, boom. Hopefully I can, there we go. Okay, this is the document of which we are going to speak today. Okay, everybody see that all right? Now, this is from the Joseph Smith Papers Project. I want to say this as we get going here. If there is anything I can commend the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints on, it is the Joseph Smith Papers Project. I think that the brethren are actually learning some things. You can clip that. Jacob, you can clip that. You guys can clip that. I think the church has learned that transparency is important. Unfortunately, I don't think they've learned it because it's the honest thing to do, which you'd think men of God would consider that. I think they figured out exactly what I've been saying here so far, that the more that they abridge and lie and hide the truth about Joseph Smith, is the more they come off as liars when people start to deconstruct the faith, and the more that people decide that they're just going to leave the church, that they're not going to just challenge it and say, the brethren say this thing, and it turns out it needs to be treated with more nuance. At some level, just like those 4 stages I told you, they jump straight to, I can't believe I ever believed this shit to begin with. These men have lied to me my entire life, which a lot of saints are on the verge of doing right now. You got your polygamy deniers, your history deniers. You got these people who are learning that there's more to the story of Joseph Smith than what they have been told. And it's in your interest as a person of faith in the church, if you are a person who believes in the church, to learn it. Let me just see if I can get a better orientation here. This is crappy, man. Here we go. How about that? Okay, so here's the document. I'm not going to read from the document itself. I'm going to be reading from some other documents. But suffice it to say, this is the document, General Smith's view of the powers and policy of the government of the United States, circa the 26th of January to 7th of February, 1844. Now, that year is important, okay? Within 6 months of the publication of this pamphlet, Joseph Smith will be dead. Of course, he doesn't know that. But it's important to note, at this time, Joseph Smith has it in his mind. He is mayor of Nauvoo, Illinois, and he's a man with significant power in the state of Illinois. He actually is. And they have even circulated some straw polls at this point in time to see if Joseph Smith were a candidate for president, how likely would you be to vote for him over these other candidates? And it turns out some people, not all of them Latter-day Saints, had answered, I'd vote for him. And so he wasn't, I don't think, a terribly viable candidate, but at least there were some people who he had started to persuade. So one of the claims is that in this document, Joseph Smith calls for abolition of slavery. That was because they say Joseph Smith was an abolitionist. He was not a racist. He was a man who believed in equality among the races, and that flatly is not true. Joseph Smith was racist, and he was particularly racist about Black people, and he taught racism against Black people. as doctrine of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and of its holy scriptures. I'm going to prove it to you now, and it's just sit with it. All I'm asking is don't believe me, believe a church produced source here on the subject, okay? You want to believe church produced sources? Groovy. Let's do some of that. Go ahead and remove this. I want to show you something else. Oh, well, no, but actually before I go to that, I wrote a script because so I wouldn't ramble as much. Okay. So this was published in 1844. It proposed that a constitutional amendment should scale down slavery leading up to the year 1850, using the sale of public lands to compensate slave owners by basically buying slaves from them. Now, on the cover page, which I think you're looking at now, yes. Okay, let me actually scroll down that. Let me show you. Okay. Whoops. This is page 4, actually. I already started getting ahead of here. Blah, blah, blah. Go back to page 1. Sorry. Page 1. You're going to notice an interesting name here. Let me zoom in on it. Down here at the bottom, you'll see John Taylor, printer, Nauvoo, Illinois, 1844. Any good Latter-day Saint is going to know John Taylor was a very important man in Mormonism. He eventually becomes one of Joseph Smith's successors. He becomes the successor of Brigham Young. In the LDS tradition or the Brighamite tradition, which is the Mormonism most people know. He also was the guy who was running Joseph Smith's presidential campaign in 1844. He also was in the room with Joseph Smith when Joseph Smith was killed, and Hiram. And he was spared himself, the story goes, because he received a ball that struck him in a pocket watch that he had on his body, and he rolled underneath a bed thinking that he was, that he was dying. And by the time the mob had left, then Willard Richards climbed back down from the roof of the prison there in Carthage, Illinois, back in, discovering that Joseph and Hiram had been killed. He found John Taylor alive and rescued him. And that's the story most Latter-day Saints know. Now, it's very important that you understand this document a little better if you want to believe that this is the proof that Joseph Smith was not racist against Black people. You see, General Smith's views of the powers and policy of the government of the United States, published in 1844, proposed. I already did that part. Okay. John Taylor was in charge of Joseph Smith's presidential campaign, but historians attribute the drafting of the views to William Wines Phelps, often known as W.W. Phelps. Now, Phelps was one of Joseph Smith's closest confidants, one of his scribes, a poet, and the lyricist of several popular LDS hymns, including The Spirit of God, Praise to the Man, which is about Joseph Smith, and If You Could Hie to Kolob. Together with input from Joseph Smith, John Taylor, and others, Phelps mainly, including Dr. Bernheisel, that's a very important one that doesn't get mentioned enough, I think. Phelps mainly wrote Joseph Smith's views. And in his views, a plan was proposed for compensated emancipation, or in other words, that the government should not just free the slaves outright, but buy them from their masters using money generated from the sale of public lands, and then relocate many of the freed slaves to Texas. Joseph Smith records in his journal meeting with his team, including Phelps, to give them his views. And he does preach and campaign on this plan to end slavery. But this is a total reversal of Joseph Smith's lifetime views, and one that frankly doesn't speak to his religious views on slavery. In fact, the conflict of beliefs on slavery was an old beef between Joseph and Phelps, I would put to you, and others inside the church. It is important to note also that Phelps had previously been briefly excommunicated from the church. More on that in a moment. Mind you, there were Mormons who believed that slavery was racist and wrong. There always have been. I would put to you that Joseph Smith was not one of them, at least not until he was campaigning for president on a platform mainly drafted by Phelps. Now consider this. Not long after the views were published, there's an entry in Joseph Smith's journal by his scribe, Willard Richards. Let me go ahead and remove this and remove it entirely. and add journal entry. I think this is the one. Yes. Okay. Here is the very thing. Okay. And it says Thursday, February 8th, 1844. So again, this is right after the publication of Joseph Smith's views, General Smith's views. He was called General because he was Lieutenant General of the Nauvoo Legion, which was the largest military unit in the United States regular standing army, basically, at the time. Thursday, February 8th, 1844, court trial on two Negroes trying to marry white women. Fined one $25 and one $5. Evening had a political meeting in the assembly room, and Brother William Wines Phelps publicly read my views of the general government for the first time. Elders Orson Hyde and John Taylor made a speech, and myself also. That's Joseph Smith's journal entry from that date. Now, Joseph Smith had been acting as a judge in his role as the mayor of Nauvoo since the passing of his dear friend and the local judge Elias Higbee. That same Elias Higbee had two sons who helped William Law, Joseph Smith's former counselor in the first presidency, to expose Joseph Smith's polygamy through the Nauvoo Expositor, which Joseph Smith had ordered their printing office burned down, ironically enough. As long as Elias Higbee was the judge in Caldwell County, Illinois, it seems that no significant legal trouble could come upon Joseph Smith, and there are those who did try, especially the state of Missouri. After his passing in 1843, that's Elias Higbee, Joseph took the role of judge upon himself, and he clearly liked it. Now, at this time, Illinois state law required incarceration and a fine of no less than $200 for interracial marriages, which were illegal in the state. So $25 and $5 might seem like a lenient sentence, but in fact, it appears that Joseph Smith fined the two men for trying to solemnize the marriages, but were apparently stopped in the act. But he still fined them something. That was something Joseph Smith had developed a bit of a liking to, according to my reading. If you want a better account of that, a more concise account of that, you can read the giant book, but a very good one, Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling, which is a church-honored, church-adjacent production written by a still faithful Mormon historian. Somebody remind me of the guy's name, Dr. Bushman. Okay, so is he a doctor? Well, anyways, Richard Bushman. But he still had fined them, okay? Now, rewind from Joseph Smith's campaign back to the year 1836. So we're going back now, this is 10 years? No, not 10 years. What am I saying? 8 years. Joseph Smith had sent a letter to his sometime friend, Oliver Cowdery, who printed the church newspaper in Missouri. At that time, Joseph Smith was still mainly in Ohio, where the first temple had just been dedicated. That same temple is Kirtland Temple that only recently was purchased back by the LDS Church. Let me show you that letter. Go ahead and remove this. Let's take a vote. Who thinks I can actually learn to get good at switching to screens? We got to come up with a better way of doing this. Okay, here we go. Letter to Oliver Cowdery, circa the 9th of April, 1836. Now, the temple dedication was just a couple of weeks before this. Okay, so I'm going to leave this up here, but I am reading you an abridged version of this because this is going to be long. So I tried to condense it down as much. I just wanted people to be able to see this is real. You can look at it, you can see it. It is a real thing. I didn't make this up, but I am going to read you the abridged version. You're welcome to go and look it up yourself. The letter in 1836 reads, "Dear Sir," that's Oliver Cowdery, "this place having recently been visited by a gentleman who advocated the principles or doctrines of those who are called abolitionists, many elders having gone into the southern states besides, there now being many in that country who have already embraced the fullness of the gospel as revealed through the Book of Mormon. I am happy to say that, Very few attended, and left the gentleman to hold forth his own arguments to nearly naked walls. Again, I want to attribute, even though it's not a perfect practice and not a perfect production here, if you are looking at the Joseph Smith papers online. Whoops, I'm in the wrong page here. Boom, boom. I guess I can close this. And I guess I can close that one. Okay. If you actually look at that, at the footnote on this by a gentleman, yeah, there's a note here that says likely John W. Alvord. So these guys have done their research. Now, my understanding is that there's some internal conflict with the way it was done and what documents they decided to include, not include, etc. But generally speaking, this document, this project is a good attempt at improving the church's transparency, in my opinion. And little details like this are things that give you real history hooks that you can look into and get more information. And it's fascinating. I personally have gotten a lot out of it. Allow me to continue here. I am aware that many who profess to preach the gospel complain against their brethren of the same faith who reside in the South and are ready to withdraw the hand of fellowship because they will not renounce the principle of slavery and raise their voice against everything of the kind. This must be a tender point, and one which should call forth the candid reflection of all men, and especially before they advance in an opposition calculated to lay waste the fair states of the South. I want you to take note of this, the language. Listen to it and tell me what you get, what impression you get. I won't ask you to make a scholarly opinion. We're not necessarily scholars here, but listen to what he says here and tell me what you hear. Or don't tell me if you want. Leave it in a comment if you do. It goes like this. And set loose upon the world a community of people who might peradventure overrun our country and violate the most sacred principles of human society, chastity, and virtue. I'm just going to say here, I hear dog whistles that remind me of somebody a lot more modern than Joseph Smith. And so I'm going to leave it at that. If slavery is an evil, who could we expect would first learn it? Would the people of the free states or would the slave states? All must readily admit that the latter would first learn this fact. If the fact was learned first by those immediately concerned, who would be more capable than they of prescribing a remedy? You see what he was saying here? Joseph Smith is telling us, look, if slavery is evil, slave owners would be the ones who would know. People in slave states would be the ones who should propose to all of us the best solution. Now, remember that when you can consider, oh, Joseph Smith was an abolitionist. Okay, he was a guy who proposed that instead of freeing people because they were equal to everybody else, we should buy them. The government should sell public lands and buy the slaves and then free them, which is not the same thing, I would put to you, okay? And then consider that he made this case just 8 years before. So long then as those of the free states, which is like the state that he was living in, Ohio, and the states he was born in, the state he was born in, Vermont, and the state he was raised in, New York, Joseph Smith was a Yankee. That can't be disputed here. And yet he's speaking on behalf of the South. And as those of the free states are ready to admit that there are men of piety who reside in the South, who are immediately concerned, and until they complain and call for assistance, why not cease their clamor and no further urge the slave to acts of murder and the master to vigorous discipline, rendering both miserable and unprepared to pursue that course which might otherwise lead them both to better their condition. I do not believe that the people of the North have any more right to say that the South shall not hold slaves than the South have to say the North shall. How any community can ever be excited with the chatter of such persons, boys and others who are too indolent to obtain their living by honest industry and are incapable of pursuing any occupation of a professional nature is unaccountable to me. And when I see persons in the free states signing documents against slavery, it is no less, in my mind, than any array of influence and a declaration of hostilities against the people of the South. What can divide our Union sooner? God only knows. I do not doubt, but those who have been forward in raising their voice against the South will cry out against me as being uncharitable, unfeeling, and unkind, wholly unacquainted with the gospel of Christ. It is my privilege, then, to name certain passages from the Bible and examine the teachings of the ancients upon this matter, as the fact is incontrovertible that the first mention we have of slavery is found in the Holy Bible, pronounced by a man who was perfect in his generation and walked with God. And so far from that predictions being a verse from the mind of God, it remains as a lasting monument of the decree of Jehovah to the shame and confusion of all who have cried out against the South, in consequence of their holding the sons of Ham in servitude. And I just want to, before we go on much further, I just want to make sure that we're clear here, okay? Because this is going to come up. It is mentioned several times by Mormons that this idea of the curse of Ham does not start with Mormonism, and that's certainly true. That a lot of people believed it, but then you'll hear again and again and again that Joseph Smith was not racist because he didn't believe in the curse of Ham, and or that in particular what Mormons would later come to believe, and it was later that Mormons came to believe it, that men who were black should not hold the priesthood in the church. That doctrine actually was much later than most people think, and it does appear that Joseph Smith himself ordained black men to the priesthood. But again, your having black friends does not mean you are not racist against black people, and your ordaining people to the priesthood does not prove that you're not racist against black people. The idea of the curse of Ham, as you're going to hear it summarized here, if you read this document, is basically that one of the sons of Ham violated his father, or one of the sons of Noah, excuse me, Ham violated his father's nakedness, whatever that means, knew his father's nakedness or what have you. And because of that, his seed, who were black, we're given to understand, are cursed forever not to be able to hold the priesthood in Mormon tradition, and also to be slaves unto the other brothers, the sons of the other sons of Noah. It's a pretty wicked and cruel doctrine that is not really as biblically supported as these men thought. It was used by Christians to encourage slaves to consider themselves inferior racially and to remain in slavery. That's the whole purpose of the curse of Ham. And this is Joseph Smith teaching it exactly in this way. We continue, and he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. And he said, Blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant." Canaan is the descendants of Ham. "God shall enlarge Japheth," the other son, "and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem." That's the righteous son. As I understand it, the one for whom the term Semite is largely attributed. When you say anti-Semite, it means against the people who are the children of Shem. "And Canaan shall be his servant." And then he attributes that Genesis 8, 25, 26, 27, and 12. That doesn't make a lot of sense. But anyway, 12. I didn't check it. I just took it from Joseph Smith, man. Maybe Joseph didn't do his homework all the way. I don't know. I probably made a mistake there. Joseph Smith continues, "Trace the history of the world from this notable event down to this day, and you will find the fulfillment of this singular prophecy. What could have been the design of the Almighty in this wonderful occurrence is not for me to say, but I can say that the curse is not yet taken off the sons of Canaan, neither will be until it is affected by as great power as caused it to come. And the people who interfere the least with the decrees and purposes of God in this matter will come under the least condemnation before him, and those who are determined to pursue a course which shows an opposition and a feverish restlessness against the designs of the Lord will learn, when perhaps it's too late for their own good, that God can do his own work without the aid of those who are not dictated by his counsel. I must not pass over a notice of the history of Abraham. Paul says that the gospel was preached to this man, and it is further said that he had sheep and oxen, men servants, and maid servants, etc. From this, I conclude that if the principle had been an evil one, slavery, he would have been instructed differently. And if after a man had served 6 years, he did not wish to be free, then the master was to bring him unto the judges, bore his ear with an awl, and that man was to, quote, serve him forever, close quote. The conclusion I draw from this is that this people were led and governed by revelation, and if such a law was wrong, God only is to be blamed, and abolitionists are not responsible. I beg leave to drop a word to the traveling elders. That's the missionaries, especially the missionaries in the South. You will do well to search the book of covenants, in which you will see the belief of the church concerning masters and servants. Let me pull that up, by the way, because I happened to find that while I was preparing here. I'll pull this down, stop screen, share screen. This is the document which he is referring to here. Appendix 4, Declaration on Government and Laws. Okay. On government and law. Okay. Concerning masters and servants. All men are to be taught to repent, but we have no right to interfere with slaves contrary to the mind and will of their masters. In fact, it would be much better and more prudent not to preach at all to slaves until after their masters are converted, and then teach the master to use them with kindness, remembering that they are accountable to God, and that servants are bound to serve their masters with singleness of heart, without murmuring. I do most sincerely hope that no one who is authorized from this church to preach the gospel will so far depart from the scripture as to be found stirring up strife and sedition against our brethren of the South. Having spoken frankly and freely, I leave all in the hands of God, who will direct all things for his glory and the accomplishment of his work. Praying that God may spare you to do much good in this life, I subscribe myself your brother in the Lord, Joseph Smith Jr. Pretty plain. Let me pull up the next document before we go on here. Boom, boom, boom. This one, I believe. Mhm. Okay. Now, it's important to point out that when Joseph Smith sent this letter from Ohio, a free state, to be published in Missouri, a slave state, it was after a recent article had been published in the same Mormon newspaper calling for abolition and for Negroes and mulattoes, the words that were used at that time, to move to the Mormon community in Missouri and enjoy communion with the saints. That article was written by William Wines Phelps, as I understand it. I didn't even look it up. That's the way I read it. Remembering that, now remember that guy, right? Guy who was responsible for writing Joseph Smith's views in his presidential campaign 8 years later. And it was used by the Mormons' neighbors in Missouri to stir up opposition to the saints, which ultimately results in what was known as the 1838 Mormon War, which then led to Joseph Smith being imprisoned in Liberty Jail, in part based on testimony from W. Phelps, who was excommunicated in part for that. Now, this was during a time, by the way, when a lot of people, David Patton, Oliver Cowdery, who was Joseph Smith's best friend, were providing affidavits against Joseph Smith. I don't have it pulled up here, but one that I find people are surprised when Mormons defend Joseph Smith against the accusation that he was like Muhammad. I find it surprising that many Latter-day Saints still don't know that, according to David Patton, if I'm remembering correctly, uh, gave testimony that Joseph Smith had said that he would be to this generation a second Muhammad, whose motto in treating for peace was all Quran or the sword. So would it be with us, Joseph Smith or the sword? Now, that is a secondhand account. A lot of Mormons like to point out that you can't trust secondhand accounts. I find that remarkable, considering that right in the front of the Book of Mormon itself, you have the testimony of 3 witnesses and the testimony of 8 witnesses, which are a secondhand account. They're not signed documents. They're not signed testimonials of these individual witnesses. And yet every Mormon has been told their entire lives that these men carried their testimony to the grave and never denounced it, never deviated. Those are both lies. These men all had different variations, different levels of denial or acceptance about the story. And the document that was written by Oliver Cowdery. He summarized it on all their behalf. It is a secondhand account, according to Oliver Cowdery, who was only one of the witnesses and spoke for all the others when he wrote it down. If that secondhand account is okay because it confirms your faith, but another secondhand account is not okay because it challenges your beliefs, then there's a serious logical error there, in my opinion. In my opinion, I think most people, it should prick their conscience. But in any event, so did Joseph Smith invoke scripture here to advocate for slavery just to soothe the hurt feelings of pro-slavery Missourians and avoid bloodshed? I would say that the camp of Israel, or Zion's camp, the so-called Salt Sermon, and the resulting violence that ensued was proof that Joseph Smith was unafraid to fight in Missouri. Again, he did say that he would make the United States one gore of blood from the Atlantic to the Rocky Mountains to fight against his neighbors. And he wasn't fighting on behalf of abolition. He was fighting on behalf of his own brethren in this case. So I don't buy those people who would say Joseph Smith would abuse his position as the prophet, as the president, as a prophet, seer, and revelator to try and manipulate the local local neighbors by convincing his neighbors that he believed in slavery when he didn't in fact do it. But let's suppose that it's at least plausible Joseph Smith was a man of such low character as to abuse his position for that very reason. Well, let me continue with this, okay? Joseph Smith was a very violent man. I won't recount to you all the many instances in which he is known to brawl and to threaten people, and we need not revisit that his childhood friend Orrin Porter Rockwell was very likely sent to attempt to assassinate Governor Lilburn Boggs in Missouri. But here we are addressing racism and slavery. So remember that years before Joseph Smith was quoting the mark of Cain and the mark of Ham to justify slavery. The mark of Cain is the belief that black people originated with Cain, the son of Adam and Eve, who slew his brother Abel. In 1830, fresh off of the translation of the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, in the same way that they had done with the Book of Mormon, started translation of the Bible, or rather retranslation of the Bible, starting with Genesis, which was later republished as the Book of Moses, which reads, "And Enoch also beheld the residue of the people, which were the sons of Adam. And they were a mixture of all the seed of Adam, save it was the seed of Cain. For the seed of Cain were black, and had not place among them." Moses 7:22. Now, Joseph Smith could have written that passage any way that he liked. These people, I mean, he did this. He inserted whole chapters into the Bible. It just received through the holy Wi-Fi. He could write it any way he wants, and he chose to write that there was a curse placed upon the seed of Cain, and it was that they were black, so that they could not be included in the generations of the true sons of Adam and Eve, until eventually Noah has a son, Ham, who marries a woman that we're given to understand from Mormon scripture was black, which many people believed at the time. And so their descendants are predestined, being being black to be servants to the others, including the House of Israel, which Joseph Smith and the Mormons believed themselves to be as white Europeans. Also, we come to find out in a recent episode where we were covering a conversation between an evangelical preacher kid. I forget the kid's name. Where he went and interviewed the guy who's the head of the Klan, and he basically said the same thing about the Klan's beliefs about about the origins of white people, and even made the case that he makes the case that black people were not even human, but but that at least that white people were the lost tribes of Israel, and that is what Joseph Smith believed and taught. Um, what's going on here? Leave me alone. All right, let's move on. Joseph Smith had written that passage anyway, like blah blah blah. Did that already? Yeah, yeah. Joseph Smith chose the mark of Cain and the curse of Ham long before conflict broke out in Missouri because he believed it. And that isn't the only thing that he believed. In 1831, so again, same time, when the book of Moses was retranslated, there was a revelation given by Joseph Smith that was recorded by that same man we've heard before, W. W. Phelps, telling the first missionaries to the Lamanites, or Indians, instructing them to practice polygamy. Let us now look at that document. Again, this is not taken out of context. This is not taken from, Fawn Brody. This is not taken from my book, The Korihor Argument. This is from a church-produced project, the Joseph Smith Papers Project. And you can read it for yourself here. I will zoom in. Well, I can't do too much. There's only so much I can do. Okay. You're going to see here, there's a 4 in the margins over here. Let me make sure that you can actually see that. Can everybody see that okay? There's a 4 in the left-hand margin. That's where you're going to start, okay? It reads. Here, I'm going to try and read it off of the actual handwriting. No, I'm not. I'm going to read it. I already did that earlier. Might as well take advantage of the work I've already done. Verily I say unto you, that the wisdom of man in his fallen state knoweth not the purposes and the principles of my holy priesthood. But ye shall know when ye receive a fullness by reason of the anointing. For it is my will that in time ye should take unto you wives of the Lamanites and Nephites, that their posterity may become white, delightsome, and just, for even now their females are more virtuous than the Gentiles, close quote. Okay. So this is, again, from the Joseph Smith Papers Project. You can look it up. So now I will point out, before somebody comes at me, don't at me, saying that this document was a letter from William Wines Phelps to Brigham Young 30 years later in 1861. So obviously, he made it up out of his memory. We don't know the source material of this letter, of this context, this word for word copy of a revelation that Joseph Smith gave to W. W. Phelps, except to say that W. W. Phelps told Brigham Young, whom he regarded as the prophet of God and Joseph Smith's legitimate successor, that this was the revelation that they received. To say that William Wines Phelps got that part wrong, is to call him a liar. There's just no way around it. And this is a man who was very well regarded in the Mormon community. He was a Mormon pioneer. He was one of the original great people in the movement of Mormonism. And he was Joseph Smith's lifelong friend, frankly, even if they were briefly estranged after he basically testified against Joseph Smith to accuse him of raising an insurrection against the state of Missouri, which Joseph Smith did do. So, in any event, let us move on. But so I just want to go into the next part here, which will be the last of the sections, but a fairly long one. I just want to say this, okay? We still contend with Mormons today who say that William Wines Phelps and the Laws and the Higbees, that's William Law, Wilson Law, etc., and William Law's wife, Mary? I'm forgetting now. Austin Cowles, and multiple other people, including all of Joseph Smith's successors in the presidency of the LDS Church down to this very day, are all liars and conspirators with Brigham Young, who was the real pervert and just blamed polygamy all on Joseph. And frankly, this fairly racist thing. Remember that in the Book of Mormon, the original versions, drafts of the Book of Mormon, up until the 20th century, there were multiple drafts of the Book of Mormon where they corrected the grammar and updated the grammar. And through multiple revisions, the Book of Mormon said that the difference between the Lamanites, who are given to be the ancestors of at least some Indians, I put to you that it did say originally back in the 19th century that it was the Indians. But now the narrative is maybe some native indigenous peoples in the Americas somewhere, some bottleneck, as they call it, trail of people were actually Jewish descendants of Lehi from Jerusalem, 600 BC, right? That the difference between them and their cousins, the Nephites, was that the Lamanites were dark and loathsome, and the Nephites were white and delightsome. And remember that Joseph Smith considered himself, who was very much a white man, and his converts to be descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, who were also supposedly from the same stock as these Nephites and Lamanites. And the reason why Lamanites looked differently was because they were wicked, and to prevent them from miscegenation, or the idea, or from blood mixing with the more pure white and delightsome. And so when you see this passage in William Wines Phelps' letter, Joseph Smith is specifically calling out that it is a revelation of God that the time has come for indigenous peoples, for natives, that they be made white and delightsome by the brethren marrying their daughters who are more virtuous than the Gentiles, than women of the Gentiles. Ugh. So you can miss me with this accusation that there was no racism in Mormonism until Brigham Young. And frankly, saints, if you're out there listening, when you're listening, it's a little bit weird, don't you think? To throw Brigham Young under the bus. And Brigham Young was racist. Sure, he was. John Taylor was racist. Yeah, absolutely. Lorenzo Snow was racist. This is a church with a long history of racism. To say that it isn't, or pretend that it isn't, is to be quite problematic. And again, it's just setting people up for to have further to fall when they deconstruct. And as a person who has deconstructed Mormonism and supported many people through the deconstruction from Mormonism, I have to say, I really wish you guys would stop. I wish you would stop talking about Joseph Smith as if the man walked on water, okay? He was a man who was not only a product of his time, but he was particularly violent. He was a man with a reputation as being a very heavy drinker. He was known for his racist opinions, and even people inside the church opposed him. Even his closest friends opposed him in his racist ideas about slavery and in his ideas about polygamy. Certainly, there were people who resisted Joseph Smith about polygamy, which we can see, according to William Wines Phelps, again, close confidant of Joseph Smith, brought back into the church even after his excommunication, and a confidant of Brigham Young's, who told him, this is the revelation we received, and it was back in 1831. Now, mind you, the revelation that we know as the doctrine, yeah, well, curious. It is a curious claim there, Richard. So there are there were always people who opposed Joseph Smith's ideas. But the idea that racism started with Brigham Young, first of all, seems to me kind of counterintuitive to the claims that a prophet of God will never be allowed to lead the people astray. Why should that be different with Brigham Young than it was with Joseph Smith? Lionizing Joseph Smith in this regard is just ridiculous, if you ask me. Let me switch this to a different. There we go. All right, let us move on. And even this mainstream Latter-day Saints claim on the basis that there are no living descendants of Joseph Smith by his other wives, beside Emma, according to DNA research. Now, even Ugo Perigo, I could probably attempt to say that in Italian. I'm not going to. You're welcome. The Mormon geneticist who is attributed with disproving Joseph Smith having sex with his wives by claiming that Joseph Smith has no living descendants by his other wives, admits that this cannot be definitively proven because not all sex results in pregnancy. Not all pregnancies result in children, and not all children result in 3 or 4 generations or more of modern descendants. Consider this. Where are the modern descendants of Joseph and Emma's son, Alvin? Where are the descendants of their adopted son, John Murdoch Smith? Where are the descendants of the twins that John and Julia Murdoch Smith replaced in the Smith household? And you talk about a sensitive subject. If you know, you know. It is a very tender point, but a logical one, to remember that all 3 of these boys and 1 girl, I believe, died in infancy. Their parents still had sex because that's how pregnancies have always happened, with one disputed exception. Where are the modern descendants of John Murdoch Smith's twin sister, Julia Murdoch Smith, who grew to adulthood and married an abusive alcoholic and left him before they had children and moved back home with her mother in Nauvoo, where she passed away? Similarly, there are documented pregnancies attributed to Joseph Smith who have no modern lineage, and some where there is no modern lineage that has been where there is modern lineage, that has been proven to be from someone besides Joseph Smith. Now, one of the more interesting cases is Josephine Lyon, who wrote the following. Just prior to my mother's death in 1882, she called me to her bedside and told me that her days on earth were about numbered, and before she passed away from mortality, she desired to tell me something which she had kept as an entire secret from me and from all the others, but which she now desired to communicate to me. She then told me that I was the daughter of the prophet Joseph Smith, she having been sealed to the prophet at the time that her husband, Mr. Lyon, was out of fellowship with the church. Close quote. So her mother, Sylvia Sessions Lyon, married Joseph Smith, the story goes, while she was legally married to her legal husband, Windsor Lyon, who left her right around the time when his relationship with the saints in Nauvoo soured, and ultimately it turns out that his wife was almost immediately sleeping with Joseph Smith. Now, Ugo Perigo's research shows, with some definitive evidence, that Josephine was not likely the daughter of Joseph Smith. Much more likely, she was the daughter of Windsor Lyon. What a scandal. Mormon man impregnates his own wife, continued on page 6. But that's hardly the scandal now, is it? The scandal is that if Sylvia Sessions Lyon is to be believed, then she is definitive proof of something that you and I already know. That a woman can have sex with one man while she is already pregnant by another man and not ever know who the real baby daddy is. That's not weird. That's normal. If you want evidence of sex, pregnancy and living descendants is not a great way to go. In fact, it's not evidence really at all. Instead, you might choose to believe women rather than malign the name of a woman who was a Mormon pioneer and say that she just fantasized about Joseph Smith and coveted him enough to concoct some fantasy that he was doing something with her that multiple other women and men attested to his doing, both his critics and also his friends, and even critics who had been his friends and left friendship with him over this very thing. Now, to choose to believe non-evidence of Joseph Smith's impregnating his other wives is to choose to disbelieve these women. Sell it to yourself however you want, but slut-shaming pioneer women doesn't seem like particularly gracious behavior for a saint in the latter day or any other. Now we'll get to the good, juicy part that, again, If I say this in a TikTok live somewhere, throw it into the comments somewhere, I'm almost certainly I'm almost certain to get somebody telling me, "You made that up." Okay, groovy. Let me help you out here. Let me close this. Again, I tell people this. I made a response to priesthood. Some of you have seen the short that I published in TikTok and on here on YouTube. The priesthood bros, what do they call themselves? Anyways, about the word of wisdom that and it's this case. You can see it in my shorts where the guy said, "Should I just show it to you? Maybe I can show it to you. Let me just show you. You guys want to watch a video? Let's try. Let me have it here. I may have deleted it. I think I did delete it after I set you guys up for it. You guys like my new glasses, by the way? I did. I leaned in close. I put it on. I put these on. I leaned in close to the mirror and I said, Edna mode. And guessed. They're growing on me though. I don't have it here. Never mind. I retract. Yeah. Okay. Let me pull up this other story. Again, this is all from the Joseph Smith papers. I am not pulling any of this from quote unquote anti-Mormon documents unless history and truth are anti-Mormon. Just saying. I'm just saying. Okay. So again, this is from Joseph Smith papers. I wanted to show this, by the way. This is a very useful thing for Googling that I share with people sometimes. I find even people who consider themselves pretty good at Googling to be somewhat surprised at this. Oh my gosh. StreamYard, you suck, man. All right. You can, excuse me. You can go into Google and type, for example, josephsmithpapers.org, colon, is the way I normally do it, and then put John Taylor's martyrdom account, page 46, and it will pull it up at the top of if it in any way can. It'll pull that result up to the top of the search results, and you can very quickly find something if you're specifically looking for it, so you don't have to waste a whole bunch of time digging through it. It's extremely useful if somebody can say this. People say, give me a link, and I say links sometimes don't work in different, I say, so just Google this, josephsmithpapers.org, John Taylor martyrdom account, page 46, and people say, see, he doesn't even have a link to it. Dude, I just gave you something so much more valuable, a way of verifying not only that I am not a liar, but that you can find out for yourself. And it's just, okay, whatever. In any event. So again, like before, I'm not going to, well, would you guys like to see me actually read it off of here? Yeah, let's read it off of here. I have it like encapsulated briefly here, but this is the very last one. Let me just mention this real quickly. Okay, so Joseph Smith, this is the other claim. I'm gonna get this. I'm gonna get good at this, guys. Joseph Smith revealed the word of wisdom. This is the claim. Joseph Smith revealed the word of wisdom to teach men, human beings, not to use tobacco, alcohol, or coffee and tea as a commandment from God. That is a lie. It is a lie. That is not even remotely true. Nobody from the time period would have believed that is true. Joseph Smith would spit in your face if you said something like that. Okay. Joseph Smith never taught that the word of wisdom was a commandment. And he drank coffee all his life and beer also and wine. In fact, he had enough of a reputation as a drinker that his friends had to defend him after his death as being only a moderate drinker, having on regular maybe a glass or two of beer every night when he got home to refresh himself. Now, I'm just going to say this. I have been an ex-Mormon for 25 years. I have never in a single week of my life, not in one 7-day week on in the calendar of any day of any time of my rebellious life, drank 2 beers a day. Maybe that's because I have very low tolerance as somebody who didn't drink until I was 23 years old, and then didn't drink heavily except for maybe a couple of times in a single year, right? And to this day, I think I probably the last beer I had was in Tennessee. Yeah, in Tennessee, which would have been back in about the third week of March, and I didn't even finish an IPA. I do love a beer, but if you tell me anybody, no matter how strong the beer is brewed, you tell me somebody drinks 2 beers a night, for me, that's at least enough to say, well, I don't know that you would call that guy a drunk or an alcoholic, though that is what people said about Joseph Smith's father, Joseph Smith Sr., who had a reputation as a drinker. Hopefully I'll get a chance to talk a little bit more on that, because I actually think that has more to do with the origin story of Joseph Smith, who I am actively defending against the Mormons. Again, don't lionize Joseph Smith, or you just make deconstruction harder on yourself and on other people. And I have great reason to be concerned about that as a spiritual atheist leader. Let's read a little bit out of this, okay? So, is that everything I had meant to say here? Oh, yeah. Okay. So consider that this is the story of John Taylor. Remember that I had told you earlier, John Taylor was with Joseph Smith when he died. Every good Mormon knows that. He was also the guy who was the publisher of that document that we looked at originally at the start of this, the views, General Smith's views on government and et cetera, blah, blah, blah. He was basically Joseph Smith's campaign manager. He was a very politically minded guy. After Joseph Smith's martyrdom, he gave up on politics altogether, but he was very actively involved in trying to get Joseph Smith elected to be president of the United States, which, I don't think anybody really knows how good a shot Joseph Smith had at it, but suffice it to say that my understanding is that the historical consensus is that he was toast from the moment, and probably, was just trying to distract from his other legal problems. But I think Joseph Smith, the more I read about it, the more I'm convinced that Joseph Smith, who at that time had himself crowned as king in the Council of 50, and there's all kinds of nuance dancing by Mormon apologists about, well, okay, so when Joseph Smith has himself crowned as a king, stop. Everyone knows what that means, okay? But in any event, hopefully you get a chance to speak a little more on that at the end of this. Okay, so here we go. So this is John Taylor actually speaking to Joseph Smith, and this is an account. Most Mormons know this account. This is the basic account that eventually becomes the church's official account of how Joseph and Hiram died in 1844, but it's greatly cut back. And it's shocking to me that more saints don't spend time to go and look at the original document and look at these original claims to see how much fascinating stuff John Taylor, who was Joseph Smith's campaign manager, effectively, his very close and intimate friend, the guy who was there in the room when he died, and eventually his successor in the presidency of the church. Okay. This guy sat down and wrote out what happened in the days leading up to Joseph Smith's martyrdom, and it's fascinating history. This is John Taylor, this quote, saying to Joseph Smith, "Brother Joseph, if you will permit it and say the word," everybody sees this all right? Okay. Yeah. "And say the word, I will have you out of this place in 5 hours if the jail has to come down to do it." This is the Carthage jail, Carthage, Illinois. "My idea was to go to Nauvoo and collect a force sufficient as I considered the whole concern a legal farce and a flagrant outrage upon our liberty and rights. Brother Joseph remarked, that will not be the best way. It would be much better if we contemplated escape, to call for a change of venue, and while passing from one place to another, to escape from the custody of the constable, and then claim our legal rights and protect ourselves until we obtain them." Does this sound, by the way, like the plan of somebody who had done that before? It is. Joseph Smith, I will put to you, okay? And I'm going to defend Joseph Smith a little bit here, okay? Not without cause. Joseph Smith, especially by the time that he was in jail in Liberty Jail, had effectively decided that he no longer had complete faith in American democracy. And you know what? For all of his shortcomings as a patriot, I have to say that he had good cause to believe that. Joseph Smith was fairly abused by the legal system. Joseph Smith was very much abused by former friends of his. Joseph Smith was very much his constitutional rights were very much trampled upon, and his treatment and the treatment of Hiram and others at the hands of the Missourians in Liberty Jail is everything as foul as people say it is. That time changed Joseph Smith. It was a time where he was effectively resigned that he would die in that prison or be executed by firing squad or hanging or however. And it was very likely that he was headed to that very thing. He was preparing to die when the church, brethren from the church, worked a lot of angles to get almost exactly this scenario that he's talking about right here, where they're getting, changes of venues and they're trying to get dates moved around so that effectively they were able to run out the jailer being paid. And when the jailer wasn't paid, he would leave back in these days. You have to understand, this was incarceration in the 19th century. If you don't pay the jailer, he opens up the front door and he goes home. And so that's effectively, they were able to work it. And that took a lot of political influence, a lot of maneuvering. There are people who, by the way, who say that Joseph Smith was acquitted of all charges that were brought against him. Even leaders in the Mormon church who have said this. That's a lie. At the time when Joseph Smith died, Missouri was actively trying to extradite him to stand trial for mounting an insurrection against the state. But because Joseph Smith had his own pet judges in Nauvoo, especially Higbee, and then eventually when Elias Higbee dies, he takes over as judge himself, and he could write himself a writ of habeas corpus, whether by his own hand or by Elias Higbee's. And I think even the other judge, who technically wasn't Mormon, would do the same thing. I mean, basically, they could not extradite him anywhere. And people in that area began to say, not without cause, that Joseph Smith has unprecedented power through the charter he had with Nauvoo. But at that time, Joseph Smith had developed a confidence, it seems to me, and very clearly from his close friend and confidant, the man who was shot at with him in Carthage jail, that Joseph Smith believed that the legal system would never really treat him fairly, and escaping the legal system was as much his duty and responsibility as abiding by the law, that he could never get a fair day in court. That was Joseph Smith's confidence. And frankly, he wasn't wrong at that, I think. Elder Cyrus Wheelock, going back to the story here from John Taylor, Elder Cyrus Wheelock came in to see us, and when he was about leaving, drew a small pistol, a six-shooter, from his pocket, remarking at the time, "Would any of you like to have this?" Brother Joseph immediately replied, "Yes, give it to me." Whereupon he took the pistol and put it in his pantaloons pocket. The pistol was a six-shooting revolver of Allen's patent. It belonged to me and was one that I furnished Brother Wheelock when he talked of going with me to the east previous to our coming to Carthage. I have it now in my possession. Okay. Now we're just going to come down here. They talk a little bit about the governors. I just want to get to the more interesting parts here. Okay. But again, tons of interesting information here. But this is why it's relevant to our conversation about Joseph Smith never teaching the word of wisdom as actual doctrine of the church. By the way, I will include in this, I just want to say real quickly, I'm not including this second, maybe you could say third-hand account by Brigham Young later that Emma Smith, in her fury with her husband Joseph, finding out about his his relationships with these young girls and other men's wives that apparently had been going on since 1831, or sometime thereabouts. That Fanny Alger may not have been the first one. She may be the first one of which we knew. And even the leadership of the church admits apparently polygamy, the doctrine of polygamy, does stretch back at least a decade before the official revelation that's now known as section 132, the disputed revelation 132, that the prophet had been practicing polygamy for a decade by the time that even came around, or at least teaching it, and at least teaching it to make the Lamanites white and delightsome again. In any event, back to the story. Oh, the rest of that story. Let me tell you that story. The story goes, according to Brigham Young, that he had the account, and Brigham Young hated Emma Smith, so who knows, that Emma Smith attempted to poison her husband, Joseph, and that it was by providence that Joseph detected the poison in his morning coffee and went to the door and threw it off. Okay, first of all, Emma Smith was a little bit crazy, and I kind of love that for her. I'm not going to lie. I frankly don't think anybody should be doing that to their husband just because he's married 30 plus other women behind her back, allegedly. But at the same time, I kind of get it. I got to admit, I get it. In any event. But Joseph Smith never quit coffee. That's the point. The point of that. Joseph Smith never quit coffee. In fact, the only reference I know of where they first started to make reference, I learned this from the gospel library, the missionary library, when I was on my mission, was that the first reference to tea and coffee was a talk given by Hiram Smith, allegedly, who said that people have asked me if hot drinks in the Word of Wisdom refers to tea and coffee. I think it does refer to tea and coffee. If that's the truth, and Joseph Smith meant to people to understand that it was a commandment of God not to drink tea or coffee, why did he drink coffee all his damn life? Okay, so just saying here. Okay, so again, this is in Carthage, Illinois, in Carthage jail. Is the account of John Taylor, held by millions of people around the world, even today, to be a prophet, seer, and revelator. Take him at his word, if you will. Sometime after dinner, we sent for some wine. It has been reported by some that this was taken as a sacrament. It was no such thing. Our spirits were generally dull and heavy, and it was sent for to revive us. I think it was Captain Dan Jones who went after it, but they would not suffer him to return. I believe we all drank of the wine and gave some to one or two of the prison guards. Now, I tell you, nothing to me speaks honesty about a drinking story better than I think it was Captain Jones who went after it, but they would not suffer him to return. I believe we all drank of the wine and gave some to one or two of the guards. All right. Hey Saints, I gotta pour one out for our bros, Joseph and Hiram Smith. Rest in power, kings. Right? This is him. This is a drinking story, friends. Okay, I'm just saying. Okay, let's go back to the story. We all of us felt unusually dull and languid. Somebody take me up on this. The word languid, okay? And I'm not saying that John Taylor is much of a wordsmith, but the man could write. He used words somewhat carefully. Languid means discoordinated in your muscular movements. It means discombobulated. It means, frankly, in the nicest of terms, drunk off your ass. He said, "We did not send for it for sacrament. We sent for wine to revive us because our spirits were dull and low." And here he says, "We were particularly dull and languid." And then it goes on. This is a drinking story, friends. You've been told this. Okay. I was shocked when I read this, and I'm like, this is told as a spiritually uplifting story. Willard Richards sings to Joseph in preparation for his passing, sings the song, a poor wayfaring man of grief. Any Latter day Saint, any person who grew up Mormon knows this song. It is a revered and treasured and loved song in the Mormon church. It is a beautiful song. A poor wayfaring man of grief. And it is a very sad song. To give you a brief overview, it's about a man who spends his whole life um, encountering the Savior, encountering Jesus throughout different periods of his life, like the Good Samaritan, and reaches out to him and shares his bread, shares his roof with him, shares his love, and shows his love to this person as a stranger, only to learn that this stranger was the Savior himself. Very Christian hymn, and very well loved and popular in Nauvoo at the time. And then that Joseph at one point asked Brother Richards if he would sing the song again to him to lift their spirits. The story, as it's told by John Taylor, is more of a drinking story, isn't it? Okay. So we all of us felt unusually dull and languid with a remarkable depression of spirits. In consonance with those feelings, I, John Taylor, sang a song that had lately been introduced into Nauvoo, entitled, insert the whole song, he says here, "A Poor Wayfaring Man of Grief," etc. The song is pathetic and the tune quite plaintive, and was very much in accordance with our feelings at the time. For our spirits were all depressed, dull, and gloomy, and surcharged with indefinite ominous forebodings. After a lapse of some time, Brother Hiram requested me again to sing that song. I replied, "Brother Hiram, I do not feel like singing." Next page. When he remarked, "Oh, never mind, commence singing and you will get the spirit of it." At this request, I did so. Soon afterward, I was sitting at one of the front windows of the jail when I saw a number of men with painted faces coming around the corner of the jail and aiming towards the stairs. The rest you know. If you know, you know. Well, many people don't know the rest, and comparing it with the other accounts from the martyrdom. If you collect them all together, you get a little more real picture. One of them was, remember when Brother Wheelock, Cyrus Wheelock, had brought a 6-shooter and asked them that belonged to John Taylor, according to John Taylor, which he had in his possession. The church now has on display at Temple Square anyway, the museum in Temple Square. And and he brought him and he says, "Would any of you like to have this?" And Joseph says, "Yes, give it to me," and puts it in his pantaloons pocket. There's also another couple of pistols in there, including a pepper box pistol, which is a particularly nasty piece of business. It was like shooting my understanding, it was like shooting. No, Mormons don't. Well, that's interesting, Truck Lover. It's true to say that Mormons today do not believe in the Trinity. I would argue, yes, that's true. Joseph Smith is a difference, though. Joseph Smith did believe in the Trinity at one time, and the Book of Mormon does teach the principle of the Trinity. At one time, Joseph Smith taught the principle, at least of the consubstantiality of the Father and the Son in his lectures on faith. I was surprised to read that when I read lectures on faith for the first time. Mormons do believe in something like the Trinity, but to say that today the doctrine, as Joseph Smith had evolved it into, to say that is consistent with the Trinity would be a lie. No, they don't believe in the Trinity, not at least not in that way. Mormons believe in the Godhead, and they weren't the only Christians to not believe in the Trinity. By the way, I talked about this a couple of weeks ago in Godless Sermon. That there have been Christians all throughout history who didn't believe in the Trinity. When the concept of the Trinity was introduced, it was quite controversial. You've heard of the phrase, it doesn't make an iota's worth of difference. That's regarding a Greek word, homoousios, and a similar word, homoiousios. The I in Greek being iota. This was the first major Christological dispute or dispute over the nature of Jesus Christ was the idea that Jesus born the Logos, the breath of God or the voice of God, the will of God, or did he attain the will of God at some point, for example, in his adoption and his fulfillment of what's said to be the commandment of God to be baptized, in spite of his being a sinless man, supposedly speaking. There have always been Christians who didn't believe in the Trinity. As far as I think anybody can tell, the idea of the Trinity is a fairly late concept in Christianity, at least in the first 4 or 5 centuries. It was a very hotly disputed and not a very widely believed concept, though apparently there were some people who believed it during the days of the early church fathers. By the way, some of the most important of whom didn't really believe it, like Origen. From my understanding, Origen was an Arian, not an Arian with a Y, but Arian with an I, meaning that he believed the doctrine of Arius, sometimes called Saint Arius, sometimes called Arius the heretic, depending on if you are Catholic or some other kind of Christian. Arius taught that Jesus was not born the Logos, that he was perhaps fated to become the Logos, but that he didn't become the Son of God, if you will, until later. We also learned from St. Jerome, by the way, I really got to get back to my story, from St. Jerome and others. I believe that one of the popes, that the original Jewish Christian sect, the Ebionites, were vegetarians. This was the people who we are told were led by Saint Peter or Cephas and his associate James, who is generally referred to as the brother of the Lord. Some generally believed by many Christians to be the actual brother of flesh and blood brother of Jesus Christ, though that is of some under some dispute, especially by Catholics, but also by Jesus mythicists like me, saying it doesn't expressly say that Jesus was the flesh and blood brother of the Lord, and the Greek phrase that it uses could be meant to understand that he was a brother in Christ, meaning that he was a convert to the church. But it is generally, I think, historically accepted that James was believed to be the brother of Christ, and so so you have these people who believed that Jesus was a Messiah, that he was a great man, that he was a holy man, but that he was not divine, meaning he wasn't, strictly to speak, the Son of God in any literal sense, and certainly not the Logos or God himself. There's still Christians to this day who claim that Jesus never claimed to be God. And there are good reasons to believe that. So there are a lot of people. First John, who wrote that though? And is First John authorized scripture? Who decided that First John is scripture? It's a good point. Also, there are multiple versions of First John, and there is textual reasons to believe that the Trinity and concept there is taught was added into the document that we now know, and it's a good case for the when you look into the manuscripts, that it looks like they invented many passages to try and infer the Trinity where they didn't exist in early manuscripts. Not only First John, but in the Gospels, any references in the Gospels. So, look, I'm not going to tell you that the Trinity doesn't exist. I don't think it does. I don't think God exists. But in any event, we're talking about John Taylor and Joseph Smith's drinking. This is the point. Saints out there, when you get a chance to see this, which, who knows? I just want to say this. So this is me defending Joseph Smith. It may not seem that way, but this is what I'm saying. Okay. When people are led to believe that Joseph Smith, when he was a boy, had to have surgery on his leg, and this story, which is a story that is told, and that he argued with his doctors and his parents when they tried to give him whiskey to dull the pain, that he would not have a drop of whiskey, that if his father held him, he would bear the pain. And this is given to be a story, and it is one of the many lionizing fables of Joseph Smith, to try and make him seem like he was larger than life and like he definitely was not a drinking man, in spite of the fact that, as the saying goes, give a man, I think it was Mark Twain who said, give a man a reputation as an early riser, and that man can sleep until noon. When Joseph Smith, when people started to make the reputation of Joseph Smith never tasted of alcohol one day in his life, it was because they had to answer for his drunkenness. And it's only because of the accounts of things of people who are not Latter-day Saints and not faithful members of the church, and people who were friends of Joseph Smith, intimate, close friends of Joseph Smith, that we know that his father took to drinking. I said that I would come back and visit this. His father was known basically as the town drunk, Joseph Smith Sr. The longer that I have deconstructed from Mormonism, from Christianity, and from God, is the more I feel I can come to forgiveness of Joseph Smith. I still do not think he was a good man. I still do not think he was virtuous, and I don't think anything like the lionized version of Joseph Smith that I believed in when I was Mormon is actually true. As I learned the true history of Joseph Smith and more details about the life of Joseph Smith and who he was, I do feel that I know him better. And this is why I said at the beginning of this little mini sermon. If it's hard to believe that this is a mini sermon, you should see my Sunday sermons. Is that as I said earlier, it is a process of forgiveness to deconstruct faith. And while that may seem strange to you, consider this real quickly. As I said before, when people deconstruct from Mormonism, one of the most common things you hear them ask is, how much do you think the brethren actually know? Because all of our lives as members of the church, we believe that these men were prophets, seers, and revelators, that they were men ordained of God to guide us, and that God would kill them if it ever dawned on them to lead us astray. Teaching us that the Book of Mormon is historical, has historical value, and is proven historically, is leading the saints astray, is leading people astray. It is leading people away from the truth. And if salvation is to be attained, it has to be a salvation set up in truth. Even Jesus says that the truth will set you free. So I don't see that it is possible to lie people and deceive people into salvation, at least, and still consider yourself Christian. In my perspective, anyway. Somebody tell me I'm wrong. But do the brethren know that this is BS? Some of them, yes. I would argue most of them, yes, if not all of them. I'm going to have to take that call here in a minute, so I'm going to have to call that back. But that's not the point, right? Most people who've never been Mormon can accept this just fine. Oh, the Mormon church's leaders know that they are lying to their members. Oh, big surprise. If you've been Mormon, it's a big deal, because so much of your personal investment, your emotional and spiritual investment into the church, relies upon that through this system that we have been taught all of our lives, that God would teach you and inspire you in your heart through the Holy Ghost what is true and what is not true, and the truth of all things will be established. And as you come to find that these men that you hold to be holy men of God have been lying to you your entire lives, as you can imagine, the feeling of betrayal drives most of what causes members of the church to decide ultimately to either resign their membership or to pursue being excommunicated, as I did, or to go out and just become Jack Mormons, leave the church, flee from it, and just leave all practice of it, which I think increasingly would be the choice that the brethren would prefer if you're not going to stay. I think that the church has known this, and this is my opinion, has known this for some time, and that this project that you're looking at here, the Joseph Smith Papers project, is their actually good and noble attempt to become more transparent, to at least make a church produced product where people can learn some of the more difficult facts, the more difficult things to accept about Joseph Smith, about the Book of Mormon, and to learn it at their pace while the church still maintains the version of the story that they know to be false. And had they done this decades earlier, I think they would have lost a lot fewer people, as it turns out that the ex-Mormons started to take over the internet and publish more and more documents saying, you've heard this version of the events. This is the actual version of events. And all of the historians know it. All the brethren know it. You've been lied to your entire life. Everything ranging from, there are still people in the Mormon church today who believe Joseph Smith never practiced polygamy, in spite of abundant evidence to the contrary. There's still people who believe that Joseph Smith never used the chocolate-colored stone in the hat to translate the Book of Mormon, in spite of the fact that even the church has admitted to it and published photographs of the rock, which, by the way, was given by Oliver Cowdery and or his estate to the church like over 100 years ago, I think. And so it was like they've had it locked up and sealed away, and they denied it for years and years and years. They denied that it was true, and then on only to put it out there and then try to gaslight the whole world and tell us that we never said that that was true. Every time they do that, they know they're not just hurting somebody's testimony about Joseph Smith. That the testimony that members, the Latter-day Saints have in the brethren, in the church, in themselves, and in God, very much hangs upon that the church tells the truth about Joseph Smith and doesn't lionize him to make him something that he wasn't. Thank you, Pearl. Yeah, that's right. Korihor was right. Oh, interesting. That's cool. Well, welcome here. We're Korihors. We're good people. So that's why I would contend and plead with you, Latter-day Saints, when you see this out there. When I say I'm defending Joseph Smith, and then it seems like I'm attacking him, I actually would encourage you to consider this. Okay, what I'm telling you now. The more I learn about Joseph Smith, 20 years later, after deconstructing Mormonism, the more I get, though I don't agree with, why he began to practice polygamy. Some of it, I think, was just good old-fashioned, Jeffrey Epstein style values. Yeah, I think Joseph Smith was drawn to young, pretty girls and other men's wives. He became jealous and he wanted them. But the fact that these revelations about polygamy, whether it's the 1831 priesthood, revelation to the elders to start marrying with the Lamanites for racial reasons, or the 1842, I want to say, section 132, the disputed polygamy revelation, was about posterity. And the more you learn about the grief that Joseph and Emma had with the children that they lost, I mentioned Alvin, I mentioned the twins, and we don't know how many miscarriages were involved, and how Joseph and Emma's fertility problems, in spite of the fact that, as many Mormons will point out, they had multiple successful pregnancies that resulted in children, but those children didn't all survive infancy. In fact, they lost a fair number, which was not a surprising thing for the time. And, when you consider what it must be like for a parent to bury their child, it begins to make a little more sense, at least, that Joseph Smith began looking around while he was considering his legacy, his family relationships, and how difficult it had been supporting his wife Emma through losing these children and having to bury these children, that he started to look around and say, maybe I should be sowing wild oats. I don't know. But I do think that that at least had to have occurred to him. And I can at least give Joseph Smith enough grace to say, if that made sense to him, which I find morally abhorrent, I wouldn't support that. I wouldn't believe that. And I am polyamorous. I am an ethical non-monogamist. I would look at that and I say, that's cheating. That's just you making up an excuse to go cheating. But at least I better understand why as I look into the grief that they endured together and Joseph Smith supporting her. That was the one of the less innocent things that I came to understand as I learned more about their relationship and how, as my friend, uh, why am I spacing? As my friend likes to say over at the Unfiltered Rise, uh, Emma Smith was Joseph Smith's ride or die. She was his girl to the end. She believed that they would be together forever, it seems to me. And when she found out about the polygamy, that the polygamy doctrine, the polygamy revelation that was circulating, apparently she did burn it and she did react angrily and she did threaten some kind of retribution against him, realizing that the rumors of his being unfaithful to her were true, going back apparently back to the early days of their marriage. And that was heartbreaking. The people around them recorded this, that it was heartbreaking. I believe it was William Clayton who recorded that, was in the room when it happened and recorded how devastated she was. And I get why. I don't think it was right, but I get why he would have tried to poison his coffee. I get why he drank coffee. I would too. I get why he drank apparently enough to develop a reputation as an alcoholic. And I get why his father, after having lost two children at least, and made a bad business deal that cost him, his father was apparently born to some privilege, actually. That's not part of the story generally. But Joseph Smith's family were from Massachusetts. And his father received an inheritance that he basically squandered on a bad business deal, related to the importation of ginseng from China. And there's actually been, as I understand it, some development since then of discovering how it is that that deal went south, and it's a lot more innocent than previously thought, as I understand it, anyways. But I couldn't tell you. I can't cite you references, so I can't tell you that off the top of my head. But he did lose his family fortune, and then that combined with weather problems and farming problems, series of bad choices that could be common to any human being and any family, especially during this time. They lost their farm, they lost everything, they were homeless, effectively, and or they were heading straight into it. They were downwardly mobile, as it is common to say now. And as Joseph Smith Sr. started to bear the shame of not being able to provide for his family like he wanted, then his son Alvin dies through fairly mysterious circumstances. As I understand it, they actually put out a newspaper ad. This is what I had heard this, that they put out a newspaper article answering the Smiths, answering that they've heard the rumors that people are talking about that their son died in some kind of satanic ritual, and for people to hide their lying tongues behind their teeth, basically. But one thing seems pretty clear to me. They were all very confident and hopeful that their eldest son, Alvin, was going to be the breadwinner who went out there and saved the family from disgrace and financially, and set them up with a better future. That wouldn't have been uncommon those days. When it wasn't Alvin anymore, then it was Hiram. Hiram, was Joseph Smith's older brother. They said he went off to seminary to study. They couldn't afford to keep him out there, so he had to come back. And then it was Joseph. By that point, it was Joseph who was born in the call, and his mother, who believed in miracles, but also believed in kind of magic, folk magic, which was not uncommon at the time, believed that because he came out in his amniotic sac, or as it was called at the time, being born in the caul, that meant that he was born to be some kind of spiritual person, medicine man, guru, prophet, whatever you want to call it. And from that time, he was seen as their miracle baby. Then, what I didn't learn until recently was that it was Joseph Smith's mother. It was when Joseph Smith's sister had died that Joseph Smith's mother became very active. Now, when I taught the story of the first vision as a missionary, the way I learned it growing up at my parents' knees, as an active Latter-day Saint, we would always tell the story this way. Joseph Smith was confused about the many religions that there were. The true origin story was that Joseph Smith's sister died, and right at the time, around the same time that his brother Alvin had died, and their family was downwardly mobile. They were poor, and they were barely making ends meet. And Joseph, the boy who was born in the caul, witnessed his mother, whom he loved very much. Joseph Smith was a womanizer. He was a boozer. He was a brawler. He was not a particularly good patriot, I think you could argue. And he was a con man. But he loved his mother. That won't redeem him in my eyes, but I get that he loved his mother. He loved her very, very much. He loved his father very much, respected him very much, and wanted him wanted them to be happy. And he saw his mother's pain at losing two children, and especially when her daughter passed away. When the preacher at the church where his mother was attending told her that her child was in hell because she was not baptized. And when people said of her son Alvin that he was in hell because his baptism wasn't true or because he wasn't baptized, it rent her soul so badly, harrowed her soul so badly that she became incredibly scrupulous in believing the doctrines of Christianity, and particularly, as I understand it, Methodism, and began trying to save her family, save their souls, so she couldn't lose any more children, and try and find. And she was in a desperate spiritual pursuit to believe that her children who were not baptized and died without baptism would be somehow reunited with her in heaven in the afterlife. And now all of a sudden, the boy born in the caul has a church and a doctrine where he learns that children born, where he can say there's plain and precious truths in here. And the plain and precious truths include that children who die when they are small are saved in God, saved in the Lord. A thing that many people have believed over the years, but that I would put to you, you can't really make the justification for that out of the Bible. They needed something else. They needed more Bible. I think that this idea that Joseph put into the Book of Mormon, which is a fraudulent document, I think it's not what it purports itself to be. But when he put a plain and precious truth in there, as he called it, that children should not be considered guilty because of their parents or because of their lack of a baptism, I think he was right. He puts it in again. I think it was Lehi teaches a similar concept. Or no, I think that first one passage was Lehi. And then King Benjamin, if I remember correctly, teaches it in his speech. Then there's a third person who teaches that a child is not guilty. We even have a song about it here at the Church of Korihor because that guy is the atheist Korihor. And that's the other side of the story. So around that time when Joseph Smith Sr.'s family found out that he was going to convert to some frontier church, that he was being pressured by his wife to join some snake dancing cult. That's a little extreme. I've called it that, but I don't think she was that far off the beaten path. Joseph Smith, by the way, at that point Joseph Smith liked to go to camp preaching camps And he worked, I believe, at one point he actually collected. He would go around passing the plate and preaching to the congregation, so that the preacher wouldn't have to, and like guilting people into putting offerings in the plate. That's my understanding of it, anyways. I haven't read the book where that comes from. But Joseph Smith saw this, and at the time, and saw that his father's family, their reaction was to give him a copy of The Age of Reason by Thomas Paine, which is now scripture at the Church of Korihor. One of the best arguments by a man who believed in God, by the way, one of the best arguments against God, one of the best arguments for secular reasoning in the history of the world. It is a beautiful document, written when Thomas Paine was mainly while Thomas Paine was in prison in France, and it actually lays out a pretty good case for why even people who believe in God should disbelieve the Bible. Why even people who believe in God should disbelieve organized religion, and even people who believe in God, who are deists like Thomas Paine, and for that matter, like George Washington, like Thomas Jefferson, like John Adams. Well, maybe John Adams is a universalist, whatever that means. And certainly Joseph Smith's father was described as a universalist. That they should nonetheless be skeptical of organized religion. And the case he makes is a good one. And Joseph Smith then, in the midst of that, discovers that the claims to discover a set of stones set in silver bows meant for a giant, and he puts it into a pouch and has it, or wraps it, I think, in a hide or a cloth or something, and has his mother feel it, and tells her that he's found this treasure. What would you do? What would you say to your mother? It's like you ever seen the movie The Invention of Lying? It's a really good concept of a movie. Ricky Gervais, who was an atheist, uses it as a parable of sorts for understanding organized religion. And it's in this movie, they live in a world where people only tell the truth, and even if it's hurtful and painful and what have you, and it's a very gloomy and depressing world because people only say the truth. And Ricky Gervais' character invents lying while he's in a hospital room with his dying mother. And all the doctors come in and tell her, so we've been looking at your results, and it's really bad. Your body is just actively trying to kill you. You don't have much time left, and frankly, it's a little bit depressing. So we're going to leave. And and she gets scared. She's terrified. And he is sitting there with her in this hospital room, shocked, even in a world where nobody has ever lied to anybody. All the movies, there's not even fiction. I agree. Hyde, thank you. And he tells her, and she tells him, I just can't conceive that when I die, I will cease to exist. Anything but that. I can't process that that's going to be me any minute. And he says to her, that's not what happens, Mom. He breaks down. He says, that's not what happens. When you die, you go to this wonderful place where there is no suffering and nobody gets sick and everybody's fine and everybody's happy and in love and everything is good. And you're rewarded for being a good person. And she's like, and then he hears the voice of the doctors behind him going, what? Yeah. How do you know about this? I've never heard this before, because it's a world where nobody's ever lied before. And he's like, yeah, everyone knows that. What if you weren't a good person? What if you were a bad person? Well, then you don't go. And it's like, really? You don't go? Even just because you made a simple mistake? What if it's a small mistake? And he's like, okay, you get like three mistakes, and they're like, those are free, but you shouldn't do anything more than that. They're like, oh, that's good news. Hey, get everybody. And then he invents lying, and as a consequence, he invents religion. But then it all comes down to that he invents it because he can't bear his mother's suffering as she lays there dying, and he can't bear her feeling that life is meaningless and that her death is going to be meaningless. Well, so you have Joseph Smith gives his mother this wrapped thing, tells her these are stones. There are interpreters. There are ancient interpreters. I'm going to be able to use them to interpret a new book of scripture that is inscribed on gold plates, and the Lord has instructed me on where to find it. And then what results is a document that tells in multiple occasions that children are not guilty because of their parents or anybody else. That and he tells and which I think is an idea that Jesus touches on in the gospels, but he never says that expressly. And so they needed a document, a new Bible. And as Joseph Smith put into this new Bible, this gold Bible, that there would be people in the last days who say, a Bible, we have a Bible, and we need no more Bible. You can hear in that, can't you, the frustration that that he experiences with Christianity, or whoever the author is experiences with Christianity. It makes sense that that would be the son of a woman who cries her eyes out at night, thinking she'll never see her dead children again because they're languishing in hell. The more time I get and the more study I get into Mormonism and Mormon histories, the more I think I understand Joseph Smith. Don't agree with him on most things, but I at least understand that here was a man who was in pain and saw people around him who were in pain. And then it makes more sense to me that he said things like, "No man knows my history." At the end of his life, Joseph Smith told a lot of lies. All his life, he told lies. But at the end of his life, it got to the point where he couldn't hardly keep up with it. And at the end of his life, I think he saw the writing on the wall that he couldn't keep up with it forever. Eventually, he was either going to have to get honest and destroy the faith of all these people who counted on his story being true for spiritually important things to them, like, I don't have to worry about my children having died without the true baptism. If the true baptism is necessary for their salvation, we'll go into the temple, we'll go into the baptismal font, and we'll be baptized in their name, and God will, and every time that there was something that the Bible couldn't account for, they just made a new one up. He just invented a new one, and people believed it. And the more I read their accounts and their testimonies about Joseph Smith and about early Mormonism, the more I realize these people did not think this man was flawless. William Wines Phelps was one of his dearest friends to the end. Wrote the song "Praise to the Man Who Communed with Jehovah." Jesus anointed that prophet and seer. That man was excommunicated just a few years before because he testified that Joseph Smith was a violent man who who led an insurrection against the state of Missouri. They had to forgive each other. They had to overlook each other's flaws, and none of them believed in Joseph Smith with as much dedication as we are led to believe every Latter-day Saint is required to today, and it's just not true. Brigham Young didn't do it. John Taylor didn't do it. And they loved Joseph Smith. I think people think that they conspired to kill him is ridiculous, but I guess everybody's allowed their opinion. The more I read about it, the more I say, there's no way. There's no way. And so I would just encourage Latter-day Saints these days. If you believe that I am some kind of wicked servant of the devil, all right, I'm fine with that. As a matter of fact, it's kind of badass, kind of metal. I might lean into it a little bit. Don't believe me. As LeVar Burton would say, don't take my word for it. Just take a look. It's in a book or several books. They're called the Joseph Smith Papers. And your church produced them. And I have to say, and delight ye in it here, because you won't hear this much from me, Ex-Mojo. I think the church did a good thing. Relax, saints. Don't clip that. I think the church did a good thing by producing the Joseph Smith Papers. At least they're trying to gain a day late and a dollar short, a little transparency so that people could understand a little bit more, so that it would hurt less when you deconstruct. You don't start deconstructing the day that you surrender to your doubts. You start deconstructing the day you believe, and it's a healthy, good thing. All those doubts that you're told to put up on the shelf, that you're told to put in the backpack, that you're told to put to deal with on the side here, just keep it keep it in the hand, and just don't and doubt your doubts before you doubt your faith. Okay, great. Do all that. Okay, do it if that makes sense to you. But when you're doing that, remember this: those doubts, they exist for a very good reason. It protects you from getting hurt more, even if it's not, even if they are doubts about the faith that, like Lucy Smith, like the Smith household, about their children being reunited one day with their children who had passed without baptism. You know, even if the faith in these false ideas is what gives you hope now, when you that doubt behind it is the road to reason that says, maybe the problem here isn't that the Bible doesn't teach me what happens to my children if they die without baptism. Maybe the problem is that charlatans would try to convince us that there is an afterlife because they want our money, they want our obedience, they want our time, they want our political influence, and they would do and say just about anything to get it from us. And if there's anybody who is a good example of what such a charlatan would do to get and seize control, money, and power, it's Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith Jr. is a good example. I think it did start out fairly innocent. I think he was willing to bear the judgment of God if he needed to. If he needed to one day account before the judgment bar of God and say, yeah, I made this story up, but in my defense, you left us without enough. You didn't give us enough. This gospel may have made sense 2,000 years ago to a bunch of people living in Galilee, but it doesn't make sense in America today. We needed more. So I took what I had, I made it up, but at least more people came to Christ because of it. If I go to hell for it, fine, but please reunite my mother with her children, because she didn't do anything wrong. I think that must be what Joseph Smith believed, based upon my reading and my assumptions, and I admit full blown they are my assumptions. But I have worked a long time to try and forgive Joseph Smith for being a con man, a womanizer, a drunk and a boozer, and a browser, a bowser, and a violent, abusive man. The To read about Joseph Smith's abuse of women is one of the most heartbreaking things you'll do in life. Not just the fact that he cheated on his wife and cheated on her with young girls, but that he used to hit them. It will break your heart. It really will. Even if you hate the man, it'll break your heart for their sake. You have to accept that that this was a broken man who was not only a product of his time, but that he was a man with an angry personality and a serious alcohol problem. And that he probably inherited from the very man who the story is, according to his mother, who was very bitter and angry, as I read it, towards her husband, Joseph Sr., and said that Joseph said when he was having this surgery, where they removed a piece of Joseph Smith's bone marrow from his leg, that he refused whiskey to dull the pain, and said, if my father will only hold me, his father, who was the town drunk. I read that and I think, crap, man. What a dick, first of all. But secondly, he was just a child. And I don't think that this is what his mother meant for us to understand with that story. But the truth of the matter is, if that story is true, and it might not be, If that story is true, it's the story of a boy who is desperate to see his father quit drinking. That to me, yeah, there is there. I have heard that that story was probably falsified, fake to put in there. But if it is true, what a tragedy. I mean, think about Joseph Sr. Joseph Smith Sr., as far as I know, never really stopped drinking. And he was an alcoholic. And is it a surprise that the son of an alcoholic would become an alcoholic? It frankly just isn't. And a violent man at that. I would put to you, saints, when you see this, give Joseph a break. Take a little advice from your leaders. Give Joseph a break. Yeah, absolutely. Let him be a human being. And all of his successors the same. And let me tell you, as the day is long, you will do better in your deconstruction. If you can accept not just that Brigham Young, don't just throw Brigham Young under the bus. There is nothing that Brigham Young taught that was more repugnant than Joseph Smith. Just get over it, okay? John Taylor, same. Wilford Woodruff, Lorenzo Snow, same. All the way down to just foul and disgusting human being who was Ezra Taft Benson, or for that matter, the very doctrinally repugnant man who was, what am I thinking of? Exmos. Spencer W. Kimball. When I was a Mormon missionary in Peru, depressed and upset and angry, and living every day of my life, I won't dwell on this because it is a dark subject. Living every day of my life trying to convince myself not to go into the bathroom in the middle of the night, it ended. I read a book called The Miracle of Forgiveness by Spencer W. Kimball in hopes that I could hope that God would forgive me for being tempted to take my own life, and that I could learn some forgiveness for myself for being insufficient for God and for God's work, and insufficient for my family, insufficient for myself. And let me tell you, there's a reason why the Mormon church doesn't sell that book anymore. It was one of the most despicable, hateful, hurtful things I have ever experienced in my life for a time back in the 1990s when they used to tell us that we had to read this book. It was not a book of scripture. It was the musings of an old curmudgeon named Spencer W. Kimball, who had no frame of reference for what real life was like for people who had to live in the real world, and wanted everybody to feel guilty all the time, and used it for leverage to keep people in the church, to make them convinced that, you know, you can leave the church, but you can't leave it alone. That's because the church is true, and you will work yourself down into hell if you leave. And it was after I read that book and happened to complain to my mother in a letter that had really hoped that this book would encourage me to believe that I could find forgiveness for myself and find forgiveness from God. And I felt more depressed than I had ever felt. That she wrote back to me that Christmas and sent me a gift that was the book "Standing for Something" by President Hinckley. I don't know. I don't know what to believe about that man, but that book was really important to me. I needed that book in my life. But as I decided that I was going to stand for more, I realized I needed to forgive more than myself. That to forgive myself, I had to forgive God. I had to forgive Joseph Smith. I had to forgive the church. And I did it perhaps in an ill advised way, but it's one that works for me and it has worked for many people. And that was that I decided I cannot believe that God would abandon me in my darkest hour while I was on his errand, even if God, the true God, was some other God. That my sincerity of heart in going to South America to preach repentance and preach to other people, that he would allow that to happen, and all the loneliness and all of the depression and all of the self-blame and self-doubt that drove me nearly to take my own life several times, that he would just on with indifference, and whenever I reached out to him, he wouldn't be there. That the only way I could believe that I could get past that was to conclude that he just doesn't exist at all. And to believe that there was no God, there was no afterlife, that organized religion, including the religion I was there to sell other people, were all just the tools of charlatans to try and manipulate and exploit and gaslight other people. Even if I wasn't ready, even if in my cognitive dissonance, I wasn't ready to say that out loud to anybody else or allow it to change my behavior entirely, the relief that came from that realization meant I could begin to find a reason to believe that I was not as evil or terrible as I thought I was, that I was certainly not as bad as Joseph Smith, that I certainly was not as bad as a God who would abandon me, and that if I was going to live a life that was worth something, I needed to feel in myself that that my life was worthwhile. And it was then that many times, it occurred to me to say, it's like Korihor. I know that this may be the preachy part here. But when I would read the story of Korihor, I would skip over it because I thought, this guy is not wrong. And he has to bear the worst punishment for the fact that he was willing to speak up and speak truth to power. He had to be censored and killed because they could not bear for somebody to speak truth to power. And I realized that that wasn't me. I wasn't willing. I wasn't able to speak. That my voice was silenced like Korihor's. And then I began to understand, if I make it through this experience, I will be only made better by it if I can use it to help other people. Didn't realize it'd take 20 years. But now there's the Church of Korihor. Amen. I spoke about a hymn. I got to take a phone call now. That I'd like to close with here, if I have it. And it is called A Child is Not Guilty. Remember the teaching of Korihor. A child is not guilty because of its parents or any other reason. Flash bright, my friends.
Child is not guilty for laughing too loud, making mistakes, or chasing a cloud. Let children speak. Listen, you will find their laughter wonder, potential undefined. Let them run, let them laugh and grow. Sing the song that only their hearts know. A child is not guilty, born to be free. Don't blame them because of you or me. Let them dance, let them shout, they illuminate the way. A child is not guilty, give them room to play. Corey hoards wisdom. We're born of the sky. The children in us look up to ask why. Remember innocence. You will see their joyful voices echo in you and me. Let them run wild like the river's course, free of gods, of sin, of our remorse. A child is not guilty, born to be free. Don't blame them because of you or me. Let them dance, let them shout, they illuminate the way. A child is not guilty, give them room to play. We are all born immature, flawed in each other's minds. We all judge and are judged all of our childish lives. Let this voice speak, all judgments melt. The wondrous child within yourself. A child is not guilty, born to be free. Don't blame them because of you or me. Let them dance, let them shout, they illuminate the way. A child is not guilty, give them room to play.